and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Ethan.
Ethan, today, okay, so I have some sad news to start out the podcast, which I hate doing, but a few days ago, we got the sad news that Terry Garr passed away at the age of 79, and I know that she was such a beloved actress for me. I had gushed about her in our trivia section when she was a guest star on MASH, so we just wanted to give a little acknowledgement to Miss Terry Garr.
Yeah, her passing is very unfortunate. That is the one trivia segment that we've done where I'm like, oh, I feel bad that I didn't know who she was, because she had such a good career, and I have seen her in other things, but I'm just not very good with, like, faces, especially, you know, this long ago. But once you see Terry Garr's, like, filmography, it is maybe one of the most impressive things we've seen on this show so far, and we've had a lot of good people on the show so far.
Yeah, definitely. So may her memory be a blessing. Rest in peace, Terry Garr.
Yes, rest in peace.
So to lighten the mood just a little bit, I wanted to ask you, since this season of MASH has Larry Gelbart departing and a couple new showrunners coming in, I wanted to ask you about any shows that you can think of where the showrunners have changed and what your thoughts are. Was it better? Was it worse? Was it the same? Tell me.
So we came up with this opening topic a few days ago, and I've been, like, thinking about it ever since. I've been stewing my brain out. And there's a lot of examples of changing showrunners that I could talk about, mostly where, you know, the show gets significantly worse after the, like, original showrunner leaves the show. But I didn't want to do that because hopefully, I don't know, I haven't seen these episodes, MASH maintains, like, good quality. So I didn't want to, like, bring down the idea of, like, any change in showrunners bad. So I just want to talk about how Seinfeld seasons 8 and 9, Larry David, who was a major voice in that show, left it, and Jerry Seinfeld kind of took over as the, like, main guy in charge. And the show did not get worse, but it's a noticeable thing of, like, very different story sensibilities, where under Larry David, Seinfeld was basically his avenue to, like, vent about little annoyances he had. And then under Jerry Seinfeld, it became, like, kind of a wacky show where it's kind of surreal, where there's, like, doppelgangers and, like, a backwards episode, and, like, they kind of switch bodies at a point. What I'm saying is, Larry David, it was very much like a social comedy show, and under Jerry Seinfeld, you could tell that it was produced by the guy who'd go on to make the B Movie.
That's really funny. I was actually looking up shows that I had seen that had changed showrunners, and Seinfeld came up, and people were talking about season 8 and 9. And I was like, oh, that's so funny. And, like, I'm not a huge Seinfeld aficionado, but I have seen a lot of Seinfeld. I would not have really, like, known about the showrunners because I'm not, like, that entrenched in the show. But yeah, apparently that's a very, like, common talking point of, like, Jerry Seinfeld kind of made the show a little bit weirder than Larry David did.
And it's not a bad show, but it's a very different sensibility.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. I can see that. The main show that I'm thinking of course, is my beloved show, Law & Order SVU. This show has gone through several showrunners. So I think that for anyone who like knows the show and is, like, entrenched in, like, the writers and the showrunners and stuff like that, the Neil Baer seasons are the best seasons. Like, objectively, they're just, like, really well thought out, really well written, really interesting. And then, controversially, I really like the Warren Light seasons as well. And then what was interesting about SVU, too, with the showrunners is that Warren Light, he actually left the show for a while. There was a new showrunner, which he was fine. He was a fine gentleman who ran the show very well, I thought. But then Warren Light came back for, like, a good chunk of the more recent seasons. And apparently, like, the show, that show also turned a little strange in the second iteration of Warren Light. But that being said, again, controversially, I still think that they're pretty good. And I do now miss Warren Light because the showrunner now, not a huge fan.
Wow, okay. I mean, I know nothing about SVU, but I love that you talk about SVU like I talk about The Simpsons, where it's like different eras where it's very clearly defined by the showrunners. I like that we have that in common for two very different shows. um, I wish that I could speak on your SVU woes a little bit more, but I am very much unfamiliar with the various runs and eras of SVU beyond the few episodes that I've seen, like in syndication here and there.
Well, I will compile a list of Neil Baer, Warren Light 2, and now this season's show running, and you will see the difference. I swear you will.
Legitimately want that. Please send that to me. We could potentially do a podcast about just that.
And also, listeners, send your SVU hot takes to me because I want to hear them. I do.
Yes. Or are you familiar with a show that changed showrunner? Please let us know in any form of comment or email. We'd love to hear from you.
I love other people's like, oh, this show XYZ was really good when XYZ person was doing it. And even if I don't know the show, I'm always like, yeah, I bet you're right.
Yeah, totally.
So, switching gears, why don't we talk about this episode of MASH?
Yes, let's talk about this episode of MASH and how it's kind of the beginning of a new era to fit in with our theme.
It is. Okay, so in this episode, Margaret's engagement, Margaret gets engaged. And it's not to Frank Burns, who is taking the news as well as can be expected. So, Ethan, what did you think about this episode?
Okay, so I knew from the title that this was a big one, but it still played out like differently than I anticipated. I've been waiting for the Margaret and Frank breakup for forever, and somehow this made me feel bad for Frank Burns. I did not think that this was a possibility, but I felt so bad for him in this episode, and I was not expecting to feel that way.
Damn. Okay, so it sounds like you and I might have some different views on this episode, which I'm actually excited to explore. Ooh. And I do have a lot of questions for you as a person who has watched the show so many times, talking to a person who has not. So, why don't we jump right into the plot of this episode?
1 second. I actually have a comment on this episode in general. Continuing the theme of the changing era and how this is a big step in a different direction for the show, I thought it was interesting that this episode was titled Margaret's Engagement and not Hot Lips' Engagement. I felt like that was an interesting milestone for the character.
Yes. Oh, wow. I didn't even realize that. Oh my God, that's so funny because one of the episodes in, I think, season 1 or 2 was Hot Lips and Empty Arms or something like that. And
that's what I was thinking
crazy. Of. I love that.
Which is also about Margaret's like relationship woes and changing times. And it just felt like an interesting stamp on the episode to call her by her proper name and not her nickname that we don't really talk about on the show because you don't like it at all. So we just never really acknowledge it.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Okay, that makes me want to talk about this episode even more now. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing in this episode is Margaret calling the 4077 from, I think, a conference or like a medical like seminar type of thing in Tokyo, I want to say. Yes. And immediately you can see that Margaret is framed differently. She's laughing, she's whimsy, she's lighthearted, a little drunk, like almost like how you'd expect a friend of Hawkeye and Trappers to be in the first couple of seasons. And I just noticed it right away. I don't know if I was reading into it a little bit, but you could definitely tell that she was not just like Hot Lips Houlihan here.
Ooh, okay. That's the kind of take that you come up with when you've seen this show a lot, where you know her full arc, because to me, this opening was just that she's, drunk and like a little like not with it, but you framing it as she's a little bit more like Trapper and Hawkeye having fun in Tokyo that actually does kind of change my mindset for the episode moving forward. That's a fun observation.
Well, I'm glad that I could provide it to you because it was truly the first thing that I realized. So Margaret is calling the 4077 because she is telling them that she has like big news to share with everybody. And when she gets back to the camp, I really liked, again, how she was framed a little differently, especially in her interactions with Hawkeye and BJ. She was kind of just like vibing with them in a very like good friends, brotherly type of way. She was like when BJ is helping Margaret out of the Jeep and she just like throws her weight on him and makes him stumble a little bit, like, you know, like, hey, haha. It was, I don't know, it was just sweet, friendly bantering almost.
Yeah, it definitely was fun to see her have this more like lighthearted attitude, but the episode title kind of ruins the suspense of the first few minutes of this episode because we know what happens to her, and the whole opening act is like, what's Margaret's news? Like, what's she gonna say? And then it's just like, yeah, we know that Margaret's engaged because that's the title of the episode, but I guess if you're watching it on live television, you wouldn't know that, especially back in the 70s before they had like digital info guides built into the cable box.
Yeah, I guess that is a really good point. I don't know, unless you're reading our accursed TV guide. I don't know if you'd really know the titles of the episodes like that. That's a really interesting point. I didn't think of it like that because you're right. It does kind of spoil it and give it away of like what Margaret's big news is. But speaking of her big news too, I thought it was really funny that they dropped it so casually that Margaret was getting engaged to somebody that we have never met, never seen on screen before, and they dropped it like she wasn't hanging out with Frank in the last episode.
And I loved BJ and Hawkeye's reaction to this, where they didn't even react. They were just like, oh, you're engaged. Like they didn't even like act shocked. It was a very Alan Alda reaction where he just kind of said it in like a, that's interesting kind of way. And, you know, this episode kind of put into context for me Margaret's general framing of relationships, at least when she's out in Korea, that like, not that she has bad taste in men, because like Frank's not a good guy, but I don't know who this Donald guy is. But she is very willing to jump into a relationship kind of wholeheartedly. And with like Frank, it was in the negative sense. And with this guy, Donald, who I have not seen, I imagine you have seen, I imagine he's in future episodes. She's like, all right, well, I like this guy. We're going to get married. Like, that's a pretty insane decision to make over a weekend. But I think she just jumps in really hardcore when she likes somebody.
Okay, so this was one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. So first, a little bit of backup in my thinking, right?
Okay.
Remember how Loretta Swit was not in a bunch of episodes last season because she was off doing other projects? She was doing Broadway, this, that, and the other thing. This is where I thought Margaret was. Like, I thought that she was kind of like on these R&R trips, that she was in these medical conferences and seminars and stuff like that, and kind of like getting to know this Donald character and like hanging out with him a little bit more. So like in my mind, that's like the explanation for why Loretta Swit was not in the episodes. So even though the engagement seems a little rushed, if you take it from that lens, it kind of like makes a little bit more sense that she was like, oh, she was gone from the camp for a while. She must have been like canoodling with somebody else, you know, in her spare time.
Okay,
so
that's interesting.
So, but here's the thing is that as a kid, when I watched it, I felt like it kind of came out of nowhere, and that could have just been like the way I was watching it, maybe like potentially out of order or whatever the case was. But nobody really freaks out about her meeting this guy over a weekend and getting engaged. Yeah. So I wanted to get your take on that. Like, did you read it as she met this guy at this conference and decided to get engaged in like 2 days? Or did you like think about it a little bit more?
No, the first one is how I thought about it. I thought she met this guy at the conference and they just like really hit it off and they just decided to get like engaged because that's what people did in the 50s. You know, they're like, oh, we like each other. mildly. We have to get engaged right now. But I like your headcanon, let's say, that she's like met this guy before and they've had like an on the side romance. Because we know that Margaret, does have relationships outside of Frank that like maybe she had a little bit of an on the side hush hush relationship with this guy. And then spending this one weekend together like really confirmed it. It's still kind of insane to get engaged in this context, but I like your framing of it being a more built up thing. But watching it on my own, I definitely read it as they met this weekend and got engaged this weekend, which again I think is why nobody reacts, because they're like, that's too insane for me to even react to.
I know that Colonel Potter says to Margaret, hey, like, as your friend, are you sure you're not, like, rushing into this? Which is why I think that your reading of it is probably the more accurate reading of what this relationship is, of, like, oh, wow, this whirlwind romance. I'm going to get engaged and married to this person now. But I do like to think that Margaret was kind of building herself up in the last season, and this is kind of like the reveal of it.
This is definitely where your childhood view of MASH comes in, because this is definitely the kind of games that I would play for shows that I liked as a kid. Not that I don't come up with my own like theories and headcanons now, but I've definitely sat down and been like, okay, but what if this happened when I was watching a show as a kid, like way more than I do as an adult? I appreciate your view of this.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you appreciate my nerdy headcanon backstories for these characters.
No problem. But I also want to point out a slight continuity issue. I don't know what I want to say, an error, but Margaret mentions that Colonel Potter dressed up as Santa last Christmas. And I'm like, how long has he been there? Has he been there a Christmas? I don't know.
I don't think so, but you know what? I can't remember exactly how many episodes they've had in like coats. So maybe he was. maybe he was. I'm not entirely sure.
The MASH Christmas is in like the timeline of like a cartoon where it's the same year technically, but they have a Christmas every season. They don't age, but you gotta have those holiday episodes.
I don't think we've had a Christmas episode yet for MASH.
I think we had like a mild one in like the first season where it was like on Christmas, but it wasn't like a Christmas episode.
We've definitely had ones in winter before, but I think that we haven't had like a proper Christmas episode, and those are some good ones. I'm not going to lie to you. I like those. But
I love a holiday episode.
But back to this episode.
Okay.
I also really liked to see Margaret being so whimsical and actually happy, but staying true to her character as well. Like, she's so military at heart, and it's so fun to see her being like a happier version of who she actually is as a character. Like her saying, I can't love someone who doesn't outrank me. And
that was really funny.
She still like says these like sexual things. And she was actually still concerned for like the purpose of why she was at Tokyo, not to like get engaged, but like to follow up on how the patients who were operated on at the 4077 were doing. And it just feels like she's her, but the better version of herself. And I really liked that.
I need to counterpoint this, okay? Because her jovial, like, very fun energy, I felt was used to kind of rub salt in the wound of Frank. That she brings up the engagement to Frank and she expects, like, oh, Frank would be happy for me. Of course he would. Like she was so blinded by this, new love, this, like, honeymoon period that they're on, that she was like, of course Frank would be happy for me. And her being like, oh, this guy is amazing, he's muscular, he's tattooed, he's a, like, whatever rank he is, was just, like, really rubbing it in that this guy is so awesome and Frank's, like, a terrible guy. And this is, like, the one time I've ever felt bad for Frank, because it's like, this weekend started, he had a girlfriend, and then the weekend ended, his girlfriend was engaged to somebody else. That would feel terrible no matter who you are.
Okay, so I hardcore disagree with this for a couple of reasons.
Okay.
I really didn't read it, and this is not me just like being biased towards Margaret's character. I really didn't read her saying like, oh, this guy Donald, he's so great, this, that, and the other thing, I'm so happy to be engaged, as her kind of like using that as a tactic to like make Frank upset. And that is brought up in the next couple of scenes. However, I know what you're saying. Like, it does seem like kind of mean to Frank. But
I should rephrase that she just has no tact or, interest in his emotions.
Here's the thing. Here's why I still disagree with that. Frank is married. Frank
that is a fair point.
Frank is like a serial adulterer, and he is married. He's made it clear to Margaret that he will not leave his wife for her. Like, there is no future in their relationship. So I don't necessarily feel that bad for Frank. Also, I do have to also make a little counterpoint to your counterpoint of, even though I did say that Frank and Margaret were like hanging out in the beginning of last episode, I do want to point out that for a good chunk of the last season, they didn't have a lot of scenes together. Yeah. They were not really like shown being intimate. They were not shown being like, sexual or anything like that. So I'm wondering in the context of the show whether that meant that they were like, kind of in like a cooled off period, or whether they were like on a break, let's say. So that's just me pontificating about the show and like the universe. I should
say that I'm not a big Frank fan. Like, I like the character Frank, but his actions are, we've talked about how much we don't like Frank as a person, not so much as a comedy character. So I am with you in punching Frank, but it was just one of those things where Margaret was so happy and like did not really ever take into account like that Frank would be upset by this, that like, it was just one of those like middle school things of like, come on, man, you gotta be a little bit more nice than that. But I do hear what you're saying, where Frank definitely deserves what was coming to him of like Margaret. And by that, I mean, Margaret deserves to be happy, and Frank is married. He doesn't deserve to have Margaret. So I do definitely agree there. And I've been like rooting for the breakup for a long time, but it just happened without like emotional catharsis of like Margaret saying like, no, I'm actually done with this, was a slight disappointment to me. Of like one episode they're together and the next episode she's just with somebody else. I like wanted that like independent phase of Margaret's life where she's like, no, I'm not with Frank. I'm my own person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do think that, I think that this was probably like in real life, the writers being like, okay, Loretta Swit has gone on the record and said, like, I was really tired of this like Frank Margaret relationship. So I do think it was the writers being like, hey, Loretta Swit, we hear you and we want to do better for you, like, as an actress, and like let you do more as a character. So I think that that's probably where the hard line cutoff with Frank kind of came from. But as I said before, I think that you could, if you want to read into it a little bit, I think that potentially you could read the scenes of them kind of just like hanging out, but not really being together, kind of as like almost like the point in their relationship,
they were
like
on
you
the
could
rocks.
see it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'm surprised, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm surprised that like they never, at least at this point, paired like her and Hawkeye together in like a serious way. Because even in the first like 2 seasons, she had a crush on Trapper. Like it's just interesting to me that this show wasn't like the male lead and the female lead. The obvious conclusion is they get together in the end. I like that it's slightly different. I mean, I don't know where everything goes. There might be a conclusion for them in the future, but as far as I know, Margaret and Hawkeye are always, like, they grow a good work friendship. They don't become, like, a couple by the end of the show. I'm surprised that they didn't do that.
Well, I can't say anything without it being spoilers one way or the other. So, I'm going to raise you that is a good comment for a first-time watcher to make.
Ooh.
That's all I'll say.
I'm a simple man. I like a ship between the two, the female lead and the male lead. What can I say?
So, you had talked about Frank getting this news that Margaret was now engaged to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out how Frank originally thought that Margaret's news was that he was getting a promotion.
Right,
so
right.
Just like to point out that Frank, hearing that Margaret had great news, he immediately thought of himself. So, screw you, Frank Burns.
Oh, you're really creating a proper, cohesive argument on why I should not feel bad for Frank Burns. Because Frank Burns also nearly kills a man in this episode.
Yeah.
Like, he's a pretty bad guy.
Yeah.
I shouldn't feel bad for him. But my caveman brain was like, no, his girlfriend broke up with him, though. I should feel bad for him. I shouldn't.
Hey, listen, I think that you are kind of embodying what the audience at the time was probably thinking. Like, oh man, Frank Burns is a jerk, but man, I do feel bad for him. So I don't think that you should feel bad for that.
Okay. I'm glad that you absolve me of my sins.
You also brought up that Frank almost killed somebody, and I just wanted to talk about that really quickly as well, because Frank makes a mistake basically in surgery. And
he doesn't make a mistake. He actively chooses not to do a thing that he should do.
You're right. And apparently he does this multiple times, because the presentation that Margaret was giving about her, what she was actually in Tokyo for, which was this medical seminar conference thing, she was talking about this patient that Frank had where he didn't, I don't exactly remember what it was, but he didn't perform some type of medical procedure that he needed to make sure that there was no infections and whatnot. And his response to Margaret when she says that he didn't do this and that he should really take the time to do this, he says, "I'm a busy man." What? Excuse me? Too busy to do your job, sir? Like, what are you talking about? And I just feel like old Margaret would have jumped to his defense somehow. But now
yeah, sure.
She's the one to point out that he messed up. And I just really like that. I like that growth for her.
And Frank says, like, oh, that one's on me. That's my bad. And then he's like, oh, I made a mistake. You don't have to make a federal case out of it. And meanwhile, a man nearly died from medical negligence. This could have very well been a federal case.
A medical malpractice case, as one in my field would say.
Right. Bard attorney over here.
So originally, I thought Frank was actually taking it pretty well. I mean, barring throwing the doors off of their hinges from the mess tent, I thought he was handling it pretty well, like in public at least.
Yes, I like that Frank's reaction to the engagement was not the immediate blow up that you would imagine Frank would have, because Frank is such a baby. I like that he was trying to be cordial, that he was trying to be like, oh, it's okay, well, this is fine. This, like, he was trying to be like a nice, jovial guy to match Margaret's like whimsical energy, where he's like laughing along with her and everything like that. I like that little bit of an expectational twist, you know?
I will say it is quite funny that Frank taking something poorly is Frank being nice. Like, he was calling Hawkeye by his nickname, actually greeting Hawkeye and BJ, telling Radar that he did a good job, and then offering him a job in civilian life. Like, this Frank is just so much better. So, like, can we get this man, please?
Can we get a Frank that feels like he needs to compensate for his failings all the time instead of thinking he's the best man alive?
Exactly. But this charade kind of drops pretty quickly, because when Margaret is assisting Frank in surgery, she's, of course, again, still like pretty giddy and excited about her engagement and talking about her fiance and stuff like that. And then when she assists Frank, he stabs her intentionally. So that's not great.
Not great.
And we've already talked about this previously, but this is the part of the episode where Hawkeye is bandaging Margaret's finger or her hand when Frank stabbed her, and he's reprimanding Margaret for being excited and happy that she's engaged and saying that she should really take into account Frank's feelings more. Excuse me, Hawkeye, Benjamin Franklin Pierce. Let's not forget again, Frank is a married person who is cheating on his wife with Margaret. Margaret does not owe Frank anything, and he didn't even treat her well when they were together. Also, sorry, Hawkeye, but it's rich coming from you that Frank Burns' feelings should be worried about. The man who stole this other man's blood. Okay, sure.
We'll never get away from when they stole Frank's blood.
No!
See, I love that you are using this hostile tone towards Hawkeye and not me for feeling bad about Frank's feelings. I appreciate that. I like your rerouting because I don't know if I could handle you really coming at me like that.
No, but seriously, I was so irritated in this part of the episode. This is something that has bothered me. I'm glad that I have a platform now to talk about how much this has bothered me, because this has honestly bothered me since childhood. I was always like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right. Like, the way that they're treating her because she's away from somebody who like mistreated her in her relationship, like that's not it. It just didn't make sense in my child brain. It doesn't make sense in my brain now. So it always kind of made me angry.
See, okay. Hawkeye being on Frank's side did something to my feeble brain where I'm like, even Hawkeye feels this way. This is how the writers want me to feel, where, you know, Margaret is kind of just being non-sensitive to the fact that Frank would not feel good about this. But you're right, Frank doesn't deserve to feel good about it. Like, we don't need to take Frank's feelings into account about this matter, that he did not treat her right to begin with. So I understand why that would bother you, especially as a kid, being the like kid you were, that you would have strong feelings about this. Meanwhile, I'm, you know, the layman who's just watching week to week being like, yeah, this is pretty upsetting for Frank. And it, like, shouldn't be. I don't know. I think you are in the right here. I feel like Hawkeye, a little out of character in this one. I feel like he wouldn't care that much about how Frank feels.
I didn't think it was necessarily out of character. I just thought that it was a little hypocritical of Hawkeye. Like, I could definitely... He's kind of jumped to Frank's defense before. I can't think of any specific instances, but he's been, like, kinder to Frank in certain episodes. So it's not entirely out of character, but also I just thought it was a little hypocritical. But that being said, I did like how Margaret kind of like gave it back to Hawkeye. She was kind of like justifying herself. She was saying, you know, with her fiance Donald, she can have what she really wanted, which was her military career, and also be a wife and a mom eventually. And, you know, she would be able to have
and
that
have
with
a washer dryer.
And have a washer and dryer, what every person wants. So I think that the sticking point here for me with this whole episode was that Margaret was never being like intentionally cruel.
Yes.
And she was just being excited for, you know, herself and her future, which I don't know. I thought that it was okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because she is being selfish on paper, but at the same time, in the full context of the series, I feel like her being happy is fine. It's just one of those things where it is isolated to this episode where you're like, oh, of course I feel bad for the specific instance of Frank in this episode, but when you look at the broader scope of things, it's like, it's fine. Even Hawkeye, like you're saying, being a hypocrite, Frank, again, nearly killed several men in this episode, and he does not, like, care about that, and I feel like in other episodes, that would be a way bigger deal for him, but because it's, you know, the episode where we have to feel bad for Frank, suddenly Hawkeye is on Frank's side. This is why I need you here, because you're a great, like, counterpoint, where this is a good discussion, I feel. We're having a good back and forth.
I hope so.
Because
I hope
you
it comes
came
together.
Prepared. You came with receipts.
Oh, well, as someone who's been watching this for most of my life, I would hope that I would come with receipts at this point. So not to belabor this point, because in the next scene, Frank and Margaret are together and they're kind of saying their almost like final goodbye, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. I liked the scene for a couple of reasons. I thought that, one, it was really interesting that when Frank came into her tent, Margaret put on a robe to kind of cover up. Mm-hmm. I thought that that was a really good, like, subtle way of her kind of covering up around Frank to, like, kind of close the door on their relationship. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, just from like a TV in the 1970s standpoint, was Margaret said something along the lines of like no sex or something like that. Yeah. And I thought that it was so interesting that they said sex so brazenly on TV. And I know that they've said it before, but it felt different in this context almost, because a lot of the times they use like euphemisms and whatnot. But Margaret saying this in the context of no, I'm not having sex with you was very interesting to me, of how like in your face it was almost.
No, I definitely agree. This is something that I noted too. Like you said, they've mentioned sex before, but in this context, it's one of those things where it did make me like bristle a little bit, because it's just like, ooh, that's very bold of them to say. I do feel like usually they use more euphemistic language, but her directly saying it is very interesting. And then the scene as it progresses did make me uncomfortable. I did not enjoy how Frank, we knew that nothing was going to like happen. He wasn't going to actually do anything, but the way that he like kind of forces himself on Margaret was like just a little too much for me. Like it's fine, like in the context of the characters in the episode, but it was just like, ooh, that's not good. Like I don't like seeing that on my sitcom.
Yeah, that was another part of this. I was also a little bit uncomfortable with this, because it was played for laughs, and it was definitely, more lighthearted than the other times we've seen people trying to like force themselves on Margaret. For sure. But this was also part of my rationale in the episode of like, yeah, I don't feel that bad for Frank and his feelings and stuff, because like knowing what he does in this scene in particular, I'm like, he's still kind of a jerk.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where I think it's played very well, because it's never implied that Frank would go anywhere further that she doesn't want to. But just the fact that he did try to an extent is just like, buddy, don't do that, no.
Yeah.
But I did laugh at the line of him saying, "We can finally cheat together." Was
oh my gosh.
Like, wow, buddy, that's amazing. Good for you for having that mindset. That's a very narrow view of the relationship that you have, I guess.
Hey, I thought it was great. I was like, wow, at least they acknowledge it. That's good, at least. So after this point in time where Margaret rejects Frank for like the last time, or at least the last time that I think, like sidebar, I don't know, like, I don't think they, like, do anything in the future, but I don't really know, you know what I mean?
This is something that, like, I wanted to ask you about. Like, Donald is a legitimate character,
yeah,
right?
they don't, like, retcon this in the next, they do not retcon this in the next episode, so.
Okay. This is like an actual change of events. I figured it was because of how you wanted to talk about this so badly. I figured this is not a like memory hold episode where it's like, oh, in one episode Margaret's engaged. This show does a lot of like surprise engagement. There's Klinger's random like wife that he had, and now we have Margaret's like random husband. Like it's a very sudden marriage kind of show. They do not build relationships. If somebody's getting married, we're gonna get to it immediately.
Which, hey, you know what? That's expediency, and that's what we like in a MASH unit. Let me see. Okay, wait. Just hang on. One more sidebar. Frank, in this part of the episode, before he like tried to like force himself on Margaret a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, my true calling is lawnmowers. Did you get, like, what is that? I was like, am I misinterpreting this? He's like, yes, what's more American than cut grass? I didn't understand where he was going with this. I felt like he was losing the plot a little bit.
Yeah.
Like,
no,
what?
That was the very non sequitur thing. I didn't even react to it. I was just like, okay, sure. I don't understand, but sure. Apparently, lawnmowers are all American. Why not? That is really funny that you brought that up. Because that is such a non sequitur, like, random thing in this episode that I completely forgot about it. And now I'm like, why did he care so much about lawnmowers for literally 5 minutes? Like, that is some 2 a.m. thoughts where you're like, I need to get my life together. I need to invest in lawnmowers. Like what?
What? That was certainly something for me.
Yeah.
So anyway, just so we're all aware, the Yankees were leading 5-0. They are now tied 5-5. What happened?
Oh no. Oh,
like,
I literally just said great. Now it's like, oh no.
Whatever. I don't even know what happened, but I'm quite irritated now. So we have to wrap this up so I can watch the next 4 innings.
I'm sorry to constantly tangent. This is my problem, not yours. I love that you're a baseball guy. I love that we've been friends for 10 years. I didn't find out that you're a hardcore baseball head until like 2 years ago.
Like, it's
a great joy.
Here's the thing is that, like, I think I just like sports.
What are you, a jock?
Like, that's the thing. It's like, I'm like, what is wrong? I just like any sport that I watch, I love. I just like sports a lot. And
you should start watching hockey so we can talk about hockey together.
I would watch hockey. Like, I would.
Legit.
Because I think
hockey.
It's very interesting. I think that, like, I think that being able to, like, do things on skates is, like, amazing. So I would, like, that any sport that I watch, I get into. I've been into baseball for years, but...
I watched every game of the Stanley Cup last year, and I had a great time. That's the only time I really engage with sports, other than, like, the Super Bowl. We're having such a nice extended conversation. Can this all just stay? All of it stay in this week?
Well, if we have any Yankees fans out there, I'm very angry, and I'm sure they would be too.
Yes. For context, in case this is kept in, this episode was recorded on October 30th. So if you're listening to this in the future of the day it comes out or further, we don't know where the Yankees stand. Hopefully,
we do not know where
they're doing well.
Because here's the thing. This is Game 4 of the World Series. The Yankees have won 1 game. The Dodgers have won 3. For anybody who doesn't know, it's best of 4. So, like, anyway, okay, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I can't talk about it anymore.
We're not leaving this in.
MASH. We cannot leave this in.
Oh, no.
So after Frank and Margaret kind of say goodbye for the last time, if you will, Frank kind of goes off the deep end, just a little bit. First of all, he pulls the pin from a grenade. That, number one.
I was screaming at my computer, being like, throw the grenade! But he repinned it, which was a brilliant move on his part. I would not have thought to do that.
Yeah.
If I had pinned a grenade, I'm losing that arm. I don't know what to tell you.
Lest we forget, he was inside at the time he pulled the pin. He's dressed in, like, full camouflage, just, like, hat with green shrubbery on it.
This is very Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, right? I mean, he had black tar on his face. It obviously wasn't blackface, but again, I will say, find me a modern sitcom that would put, like, black tar on somebody's face as a disguise. But anyway, totally besides the point. Frank's having a breakdown. So am I, maybe. I don't know. So... Because here's the thing, is that I totally understood Frank's breakdown, like, at a point of extreme stress, just extreme mania. Just total mania. That's me to a T. Sure. I understand. So then we see in the next scene, Frank has kidnapped a Korean family, and he has taken prisoners of war for truly no reason except that he has not slept in 48 hours.
No, this was wild. This is where the breakup goes from like a kind of funny kind of middle school energy of like the girl's just like, oh, I love my new boyfriend, and the old boyfriend is like in the same class as her, so it's like but the energy changes when he's a grown man with like military power and a gun. It becomes very dangerous.
Yeah,
and
I would say so.
This is a truly unhinged Frank moment where, you know, in the beginning of the episode, he's trying to be like jovial and happy, but then that energy shifts, and it shifts in a big way. And yeah, him kidnapping a family, I don't know if we're going to be able to top that in terms of the worst thing Frank has ever done. Because boy howdy, this is pretty bad.
Yeah, Frank just blew the door off the hinges there. I did think it was sweet that when Colonel Potter said, return this family, you're not taking prisoners of war, immediately BJ went to check the children to make sure that they were okay. I thought that was really sweet.
Yeah, that is nice.
After that, Frank almost holds Hawkeye, BJ, and Colonel Potter hostage in Colonel Potter's office. But thankfully, Radar comes in with a strategic call to somebody, and I wanted to get your take on this.
Okay, so as we know, Frank is like a little bit, you know, not exactly a healthy relationship guy. So when he gets a call and he says like mommy, I was fully like, this is Frank's wife, and he's like being weird about it, but it's his actual mom, and I was very pleasantly surprised that the resolution to this episode is Frank has to talk to his mom to calm down. That felt like the healthiest way for this insane ending to end, where it's, you know, a very kind of realistic, like, you know, sometimes you just need to call your family and like have a chat with somebody who's like knows you well. I really like this ending for Frank. Of course, the unhinged nature of it is kind of wild. And once again, I just have to shout out that Radar is a man who knows how to get things done.
He is.
I love that he steps up to the plate in such a big way for the ending and in a small way.
Yeah, honestly, I'm really annoyed because take back everything I said because I felt so bad for Frank in this scene.
Thank you. I'm not like one-sided here. Like I did feel bad for Frank, and it is semi-justified, even if he is the worst man alive.
So
him talking to his mom was like kind of like, oh, buddy.
So here's the thing. When he was talking to his mom, he had this big smile on his face when he realized it was her. And I just, as somebody who loves their mom so much, I understand that big smile. That's so sweet.
Yeah.
But when he said to her, nobody likes me here, as usual, that like broke my heart a lot.
Yeah.
And then he also said,
he had a friend.
Yeah, he said that he had a friend who just like pretended to like him, but didn't actually like him. And then he said, the way dad used to, and that was played totally straight. Like, what a hard-hitting line. Like, there was no laugh track. That was really heavy. Yeah. And that just, like, made me feel really, really bad. And I'm like, how did this show make me feel bad for Frank Burns here? Like, everything I said before, I still stand by, but I'm also now feeling bad. So, thanks, writers.
I'm glad that we've come to a mutual understanding of the Frank character arc and how, you know, he's a tragic fool, this man. He's a complicated and horrible man, but at the same time, he's a human being who, you know, has suffered to a degree. And, you know, we can feel for that.
That's the thing. I think that what got me in this scene was that he was actually like being sad and being upset instead of kind of being a jerk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
no more blustering. Him talking to his mom is very like genuine.
Right, exactly. And what you said about Radar 2 is so true. Like, he is such a grown man now in these later seasons, but he's still like such a young kid at heart, and he knows that talking to your mom sometimes just makes things better.
Yeah.
And I love that. That was so good.
This whole ending bit really ties the episode together, where I really like that he calls Margaret his friend who, like, maybe wasn't his friend. That's a fun way for an adult man to frame a affair to his mom. But it's also, like, legitimately probably how Frank viewed it, of like, well, I had someone who was with me, and now she's no longer with me, so I don't know how to feel about that. And not even, like, in the sexual manner, you know? It was that Margaret was, like, his partner in crime, and now he's lost his partner in crime, and he's like, I don't know how to feel about that. I had one person in this camp who I had, like, a relationship with, and now they have someone else who they care about more.
Yeah, it was definitely, it was a sad phone call. I'm not gonna lie. So there's one final scene in this episode where Frank seems, at least for the moment, to have accepted that Margaret has moved on and that they are not going to be together anymore.
He's on the mend. Yes.
And they're sitting down at the mess tent, and Margaret is talking again to her nurses about her fiance Donald. And again, I just want to put out there, I do still think it's very sweet that she's talking to the other nurses about it and that she's excited and she's sharing it with somebody and they're bonding. I think that that's very nice, because previously we have not seen Margaret have, like, any type of relationship that's positive with the other nurses. So the fact that we're kind of getting this now, I like that.
Right. That is fair. The girl talk brings people together, I suppose.
It does. So Frank is trying to make Margaret jealous here. And I have some thoughts, but I want to get your thoughts on what you thought about this little quip here.
Listen, okay, so the final line of this episode, more or less, because there's, you know, some patter afterward, is that Frank is, like, suggesting that, like, oh, he might go out with this, like, young redhead. And Margaret is like, oh, isn't she a little young for you, Frank? And then Frank goes, well, Margaret, I could use a little bit of youth in my life, or, like, something along those lines. Unfortunately, I do have to give it to Frank that was a pretty sick burn. I was like, ooh, burn. That did bring me the schadenfreude joy of hearing, like, a middle school diss. I'm sure you have your more complicated thoughts on it, but I was just there like, ooh, get him, Frank. Burner good.
He really puts the burn in Frank Burns. Just putting it out there. No, here's the thing, is that yes, this was funny and I did like it, and I'm not trying to be like a killjoy for everything. I'm really not. I promise. I did like how they were vibing together at the end, like all the guys. And Frank says to Hawkeye and BJ, he's like, haha, I got her good on that one.
Again, very middle school energy to this last scene.
Yeah, it was definitely funny. It was definitely fun. I totally agree with you. I also liked how Margaret kind of like didn't stoop to his level. She just walked away. She didn't run away crying like she would have in previous seasons because, you know, Frank called her old. I just thought that in general, and it wasn't just this scene either, I think that this episode was definitely like leaps and bounds better than the writing of Margaret's character had been in the previous seasons. But I also think that the writing wasn't perfect, like kind of showcasing in this line a little bit how, like, oh, the worst thing that you can call a woman is old, like you definitely got her there, like stuff like that. But I think that that's more like a almost like a product of its time type of thing, and I definitely don't fault the writers for being like, you know, writing in the 1970s, right? But I like the development that where they're going with Margaret, and that they're just like making her a more complex character than the person who is just like, wow, my boyfriend's married, I'm so sad.
Right. I am definitely looking forward to where this turning point goes, how Margaret develops more in the future. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and it feels like we're finally at that first step where Margaret kind of fully comes into her own as the character that you've been hyping up for such a long time, and I'm excited to see it.
And we're gonna get a lot more per character development in this season, in the next couple of episodes. So I'm also really excited to get your thoughts on where she goes as a character.
That's very exciting. I'm also very interested to see Donald, because the way that they described this man was very specific, and I don't think he's going to look how Margaret describes. I don't think he's going to have like a Popeye tank tattoo, if I had to wager a guess.
You don't know for sure if we ever actually do see Donald, so just keep that in mind, my friend.
Okay, interesting.
So I think that wraps up our discussion about the episode. So, Ethan, did you have any favorite lines from this episode?
When Frank is losing his mind, Hawkeye discovers that Frank's gun is missing, as well as his toothbrush. And BJ says to Hawkeye, oh, Frank's gonna go shooting his mouth off again. And I thought that was a beautiful pun. That was a great pun. I love that so much.
That was a good one. My favorite line from this was when Frank and Margaret are kind of fighting in Margaret's tent, and Frank says, what does he have that I haven't got? And Margaret says, lips. And Frank goes, lips aren't everything. Such a good one.
Modern lip fillers Frank burns with love. I'm just saying.
He could definitely get some injections.
Also, I have to comment on, this is not a favorite line, but at one point when they're in the OR, Hawkeye says, like, you know, Margaret's keeping her secret close to the chest. And then Frank comments, be like, don't comment on Margaret's chest. And I'm like, that's a very common expression. That's like not a weird thing to say. You know, like that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know about you.
I would say that's pretty typical Frank Burns being like, get your mind out of the gutter, even though that's where my mind is all the time.
All the time.
So since this episode was not featuring any guest stars, I don't have trivia for this episode. So
a rare day.
A rare day, in fact. Let's go right into martini ratings. I am so curious what your martini rating is for this episode, Ethan.
Okay, so I think our discussion has bumped this up significantly in my mind's eye. So I think we're going to go a 4.5 out of 5 for the martini rating.
Okay.
I do think it's a very interesting showcase of Margaret's development, and I think everything involving Frank, except for maybe forcing himself on Margaret, is, you know, pretty funny and kind of an interesting way to take that character. I have very few complaints, so I think it is a solid 4.5 out of 5. What's your thoughts on one of your most hyped episodes of the show?
This will come as no surprise to you, but my rating is slightly lower. I'm going with a 3.5 out of 5. Now, wow. I know that this is one of the better Margaret episodes. It's just not a favorite of mine. I like this episode. I know. I have a lot of thoughts on this episode, obviously, because I've just spewed them for like an hour. But it's just not like a super favorite episode of mine. Like plot-wise, not a lot happens. A lot of things are like said, but not a lot happens. So even though I really do like this one, like objectively, it's just a 3.5 out of 5.
Wow.
So yeah,
I might have to lower my rating to match you, because I was like, Vanessa's gonna really like this episode. I need to be like a good rating. But if I'm being honest, in my heart of hearts, I'm like 4 out of 5. But I'm like, our discussion was so good though that I became a 4.5 out of 5. But now you're saying that it's a 3.5, so I'm the fool. I'm the Frank Burns of the scenario.
I would still say that a 3.5 is well above average, so...
Yes, of course.
I think that my rating's pretty fair. But anyway.
When we're making our spreadsheet, just put me down for 4 out of 5.
Okay, all right. Confirmed. Ethan, 4 out of 5.
Stamp of finality.
So, just to wrap up, we'd like to give thanks to Jacob Breerbalco for being our technical consultant, Melissa, my sister, for cover art, and of course our listeners. Thank you so much. Our music, social media, and contacts for the show are linked in the description, as always. And join us next week for Season 5, Episode 4, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. But until then, please don't cope with your breakup by kidnapping families. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone. Wow, that was the most unhinged recording we've ever done. Keep in mind, it was a good one. I had a lot of fun, but that was unhinged.